coming up on The World Today. As the Association of Southeast Asian Nations gets underway, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says U.S. opposes any effort to change Taiwan's status quo. Supporters of Shiite Iraqi cleric today continue their open-ended sit-in at Iraq's parliament. Plus, Ukraine general says Russia may launch southern offensive to try to regain momentum. Welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin with China's military holding missile firing drills into the waters surrounding Taiwan today, a day after a visit by United States House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the self-ruled island that Beijing regards as its sovereign territory. State broadcaster carried footage of multiple rounds of missiles being fired from ground positions. Of course, this could not be independently verified where or when the missile firing drills took place. China's Eastern Theater Command said it had completed multiple firings of conventional missiles on waters off the eastern coast of Taiwan as part of the planned exercises. Taiwan's defense ministry confirmed that several Dongfeng missiles had been fired in waters to the northeast and southwest of the island. Taiwan officials have said the drills violate United Nations rules, invade Taiwan's territorial space, and are a direct challenge to free air and sea navigation. Taiwan scrambled jets and deployed missile systems to track multiple Chinese aircraft crossing the line. The last time China fired missiles into waters around Taiwan was in 1996. And the 55th Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Asean, foreign ministers meeting and related meetings has opened in Phnom Penh of Cambodia with a focus on post-COVID-19 pandemic recovery and key regional and global challenges. Cambodia is the chair of Asean for 2022, which groups Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Speaking at the opening ceremony, Cambodian Prime Minister Samdech Techo Hun Sen said the post-COVID-19 pandemic recovery, regional security, Myanmar issue, the war in Ukraine, and climate change, among others, would be high on the agenda during the meetings. He said Asean needs to exert its utmost care to ensure that its unity remains strong and its centrality is respected. Hun Sen said it is necessary for all ASEAN member states to pool collective efforts and combine a sense of togetherness to tackle the above-mentioned issues in the most effective way possible. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken told Southeast Asian counterparts today that the United States opposes any unilateral effort to change the Taiwan status quo, especially by force, and its policy on Taiwan has not changed. Cross-strait stability was in the interests of the whole region, he told a meeting in Cambodia, adding also that Washington was eager to hear ideas from the association on how it could cooperate with the Quad. Taiwan's defense ministry said today the Chinese military launched missiles from near Taiwan's Matsu Islands earlier in the day, adding troops on the islands will continue to enhance their alertness level. Well, at the same meeting, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi boasted collective efforts in safeguarding peace in the region and emphasized enhancing cooperation in the Southeast Asian region during his opening remarks in Cambodia. His speech came amid tension in the Asia region after U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. Southeast Asia's regional bloc, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, warned separately today that an increase in international and regional volatility could lead to miscalculation, serious confrontation, open conflicts, unpredictable consequences among major powers. ASEAN made the remarks in a statement from the foreign ministers after the bloc's chair, Cambodia, had called on all sides to de-escalate tensions over Taiwan. China's Taiwan Affairs Office said today that punishment of pro-Taiwan independence diehards and external forces was reasonable and lawful amidst raised tensions in Taiwan. Meanwhile, Cambodian Prime Minister Samdech Techo Hun Sen met with visiting Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Phnom Penh, reiterating his country's firm support for China in maintaining its core interests. Asking Wang to convey his sincere greetings to Chinese leaders, Hun Sen wished the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China a complete success. Hun Sen stressed that Cambodia firmly adheres to the One China principle, viewing Taiwan as an inalienable part of China's territory. He also said the ironclad bilateral friendship has taken root in both nations, enjoying fruitful results from the joint construction of the Belt and Road, which have brought huge benefits to their people. During the joint fight against COVID-19, the Prime Minister said Chinese vaccines have effectively helped Cambodia protect people's lives and health and accelerated the country's economic recovery and return to normal life. The two sides will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of former Cambodian King Norodom Sihanouk this year and the 65th anniversary of bilateral diplomatic ties in 2023. And to our breaking news this hour from the United States, 4 U.S. police officers have been arrested and charged over the fatal 2020 shooting of Breonna Taylor. Ms. Taylor was killed in her home in Louisville, Kentucky, by plainclothes police who were executing a no-knock search warrant. The hospital worker, 26, was shot multiple times as officers stormed the apartment shortly after midnight as she was in bed with her boyfriend. Her death sparked racial injustice protests around the country. Only one officer involved in the raid, former Louisville detective Brett Hankinson, had been previously charged over the case. But Mr. Hankinson, who fired 10 shots during the incident, was acquitted by a jury earlier this year. He's among the 4 police people to face new charges through the U.S. Department of Justice. The others are Joshua James, also a former officer, and current officers Kelly Hannah Goodlett and Kyle Meany. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the new charges today. He said the officers were being charged with civil rights offenses, unlawful conspiracy, unconstitutional use of force, and obstruction. Also, another story breaking this hour, Russia. This is a Russian court that has sentenced U.S. basketball star Brittany Griner to 9 years in prison on drug charges. She was also ordered to pay a fine of 1 million rubles. That's about $16,300. Griner pleaded guilty to drug charges, but has denied deliberately breaking the law. The 31-year-old Olympic gold medalist was detained in February at an airport near Moscow when vape cartridges containing cannabis oil were found in her luggage. Griner's defense team said they would appeal against today's verdict by the courts in Khimki near Moscow. U.S. President Joe Biden said in a statement that Russia was wrongfully detaining Griner and called for her to be released immediately. Joining us right now on these stories just in is a foreign affairs commentator, Joanna LeBlanc. Joanna, it's good to see you. Talk to us about these stories. Let's begin with what we've heard. 4 U.S. police officers now arrested and charged over the fatal 2020 shooting of Breonna Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me on. I think that this arrest is a victory for the movement to hold police officers who deliberately violate the law and use extensive or excessive force when arresting Black individuals in this country. But I think even more so, now that the arrest has been made, now will there be a conviction? And we've seen time and time again the likelihood of a conviction when it comes to these cases is often very, very, very slim. In particular, criminal conviction. Now, we know the civil side of it. Numerous attorneys here in this country, in particular, you have Attorney Benjamin Crump, who is one of the leading civil rights attorneys in this country as it relates to these types of cases. He has been able to secure millions, and I think over the course of his career, billions of dollars for families and victims. But there needs to be, some of these officers need to be held accountable criminally, need to spend time in jail, because I think that's the only way that they will understand that Black lives really do matter, and that if you're able to encounter with white suspects who sometimes are armed, and they're able to walk out unarmed and not injured, you can do the same thing for Black citizens who are considered to be a suspect in any given case. But we see this case as it relates to Breonna Taylor was a very unique case, and I do hold that those perpetrators will be held criminally liable for their actions.
And perhaps that is also the question, seeing as Mr. Hankinson, who had fired 10 shots during the incident, was acquitted by a jury earlier. What do you think the people of that area, Kentucky, feel about this, and seeing that, you know, this has come up again, and also seeing that it's taking quite some time? This is something that happened in 2020.
Unfortunately, the justice can be slow sometimes, but what I can tell you is that the people in the area are excited. I was scrolling through Instagram and other social media outlets, and I can tell you people are happy that those officers have been charged. But again, the question is whether or not they will be held accountable under the law and will face jail time. And also, several laws have been brought before the United States Congress to hold officers criminally liable for their actions. And unfortunately, some of those laws have been blocked in the Senate. So we hope that the American people will start putting people in power in an office that understand the severity of these cases, because far too many Black lives are being lost by the hands of police officers who are supposed to serve and protect. Again, they have the tools, they have the resources to ensure that victims are not, and perpetrators rather, are not dead. These encounters are not deadly. They can do it. They have shown us over and over again they can when it comes to white suspects here in this nation. But this is just to show you again that Black lives really don't matter in this country. And until these officers are held criminally liable, they won't get the message that Black lives do matter.
And Joanna, let's talk about Brittany Griner's case. We just heard sentenced to 9 years in prison on drug charges. The U.S. president has said she should be released immediately. We heard from her in court pleading with the Russian judges not to end her life. What do you see happening next?
The unfortunate reality is that we cannot ignore the fact that there is an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And unfortunately, Brittany Griner got caught in the middle of a war, and she is being used as a political pawn, unfortunately. Now, there's also the element that in some countries, drugs are just simply illegal, and you could even face death. So I think it's also a wake-up call for the American people and travelers all over the world that before you travel, get to know the law of the land, to know that what could potentially happen to you. But in this case here, beyond the law of Russia, this is nothing but a mere political action. We see how the United States have been supporting Ukraine. Billions of dollars have been poured into Ukraine for ammunition and to defend itself against Russian aggression, and Putin, quite frankly, is not happy with that. And unfortunately, this is where Brittany Griner got herself in. But I do believe that there will potentially be an appeal, and I think that the American people are going to put pressure on President Biden and Secretary Blinken to arrive to a conclusion, because people are saying that 9 years is severe. Yes, while it may be severe in the eyes of Americans, but again, there is the law in the country. So I think they'll have to reach some kind of diplomatic solution to free Brittany Griner, and I hope that will be possible.
Joanna LeBlanc, Foreign Affairs commentator, joining us from Washington. We appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Supporters of Shiite Iraqi cleric Muqtada al-Sadr continued their open-ended sit-in at Iraqi's parliament today, vowing to persist until their demands are met. Sadr told his supporters to continue their sit-in during a televised address on Wednesday. The remarks are likely to prolong a political deadlock that has kept Iraq without an elected government for nearly 10 months. An Iraqi protester, Haider Abdul al-Sahib, said he is hopeful that these movements will produce change. However, others are skeptical that their week-long protest will lead to reform. Sadr won the largest number of seats in parliament in an October election, but failed to form a government that would exclude his Iran-backed rivals. For more on the situation, joining us is VOA's Edouardiranian. He joins me from Cairo via Skype. Edward, thank you for your patience waiting. Talk to us about the latest in the continued mass sit-in protests at Iraqi's parliament for another day.
For having me, Millicent. Well, they're continuing. People are still chanting inside the parliament and outside the parliament, and they have these three-wheeled vehicles called tuk-tuks, which are bringing people into the green zone and back out of the green zone. So clearly there is some official tolerance for these protesters going in and out of the green zone where the government is located. Beyond that, it's difficult to predict. I don't think I could have predicted that Muqtada Sadr would have resigned from Parliament or had his members resign from Parliament back in June, so that was unpredictable. And he is reputed to be unpredictable. That's kind of the word everyone uses for him or have used, mercurial, unpredictable. So tough to predict what's going to happen.
Is there a guarantee of security and stability in the country while this continues? We heard from a top Sadrist official who gave followers 72 hours to shift their protest from the main meeting halls of parliament to, surrounding encampment.
Well, Muqtada Sadr has a number of agents, bosses, people working for him, and they say multiple things, so it's tough to decide whom to listen to, but he gave a very, very long speech himself yesterday, and he's calling for new elections. I guess that's basically the bottom line. If they're going to have new elections, he's basically saying, we don't want to talk to our Shiite opponents, and let's just have another election. I think many of the protesters are tired of having elections, so I don't know how that's going to sit with the Iraqi public. And his opponents, oddly enough, are saying they're willing to have new elections, which means perhaps they think they can cheat and win this time.
How badly could this situation affect the country's economy, seeing as they haven't even passed the budget for 2022?
Well, the country's economy has pretty much been a disaster since the COVID outbreak began. Iraq certainly wouldn't be the only country that has an economy that's a disaster. But at the same time, they have the good fortune of having oil prices going up these days, and they'll be having windfall revenues from that. Saudi Arabia has already seen windfall revenues. Their economy is doing quite well. And the Iraqis are the second largest oil producers in OPEC. So I suspect their economy will be doing quite well, unless you have a total meltdown and the oil ceases to be pumped. Now, that's the unpredictable factor here. But other than that, I think they're doing okay.
VOA's Edouardiranian joining me from Cairo. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, Melissa.
We go over to Lebanon, where its top Christian cleric has denounced his country's government for failing to bring to justice those responsible for the Beirut port blast, marking the huge explosion's second anniversary with demands for accountability. Bekara al-Rai, in a mass commemorating its scores of victims, said God condemned officials who were stalling investigations that the government had no right to block. The blast flattened swaths of the city August 4, 2020, killing at least 220 people. One of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, it was caused by massive stores of ammonium nitrate kept at the site and neglected since 2013. Several senior officials have been accused of responsibility, but to date, none have been held to account. Symptomatic critics say of a governing elite hamstrung by corruption and on whose watch Lebanon has descending into a deepening political and economic crisis.
The scars are still there. Internally, externally, they're still there. Especially that we haven't seen justice yet. So you feel like you're really worthless in the country. So that's why we feel we haven't moved on.
Still ahead on the program. Most of our coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as US Senate backs Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Please stay with us. We turn now to developments from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says grotesque greed of oil and gas companies and their financial backers is causing more hardship for poorest people and communities. He was speaking to reporters as he addressed global hunger and the COVID-19 pandemic at the UN headquarters in New York. The two largest US oil companies, ExxonMobil Coal and Chevron Coal, British-based Shell and France's Total Energies combined earned nearly $51 billion in the most recent quarter, almost double what the group brought in for the year-ago period. He called on leaders to stop punishing their peoples.
It is immoral for oil and gas companies to be making record profits from this energy crisis on the back of the poorest people and communities and at a massive cost to the climate. The combined profits of the largest energy companies in the first quarter of this year are close to $100 billion. I urge all governments to tax these excessive profits and use the funds to support the most vulnerable people through these difficult times. And I urge people everywhere to send a clear message to the fossil fuel industry and their financiers that this grotesque greed is punishing the poorest and most vulnerable people while destroying our only common home, the planet. We are doing everything we can to reduce suffering and save lives in Ukraine and the region through our humanitarian operations. And Martin Griffiths will be able to soon brief you on those developments. But the war is also having a huge and multidimensional impact far beyond Ukraine through a threefold crisis of access to food, energy and finance. Household budgets everywhere are feeling the pinch from high food, transport and energy prices, fueled by climate breakdown and war.
In another development, the Kremlin says Russia's Gazprom would like to get back on Nordstrom 1 line that has been undergoing maintenance in Canada, but that it requires documents confirming that the turbine is not sanctioned. Russian government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was speaking to the press in a telephone conversation. He mentions that Gazprom did not introduce sanctions against Russia affecting the turbine's return. He says it is Gazprom that is sanctioned and cannot receive the legal documents for the turbine. He says further that the EU can say whatever it wants and that the turbine has been serviced by the UK branch of Siemens Energy according to British law under British jurisdiction. Well, Dr. Olatunji Sobande is an energy economist and climate risk expert. He joins me now from Aberdeen in the UK. Welcome to the program.
You're welcome, Millicent.
Thanks a lot. I mean, Russia's gas cutoffs upend European energy. We're seeing lots of debates on the continent struggling to cope what experts say is one of the worst ever energy crises. And it still could get much worse. What do you think is still to come for the European continent?
The European continent are facing a very great uncertainty regarding the energy and gas supply. And this winter will be very difficult because of the lack of supply from the Nordstrom. One thing that is sure is that if you look at there are 4 sources of energy to gas to the EU, and Russia appears to be, the largest part. So if Russia is unable to actually supply to the EU, there will be a very great disaster. But however, the EU already planned some options to actually resolve the problems. And one of these options is to introduce what we call energy mix, where they can use all the alternative energy sources and also get supply, and also practice what we call storage facility in order to remedy the situation.
You talked about energy mix. Is there in terms of one of the immediate ways out of this situation, but how visible, viable is it, seeing as prices are shooting through the roof?
Yeah, one of the consequences of when there is no gas, when there's scarcity, one of the consequences you face is that there will be increase in price. For example, in the UK here, we are expected to have almost £500 for household each month who they will be paying for energy bill. Whereas in the EU, it might change, depend on the vulnerability of the environment. So these are one of the consequences because, they have to make some sacrifice in order to get energy to each of the household, especially during the winter period, which is actually, more cold.
Russia says the Nord Stream 1, the largest gas pipeline from Russia to Europe, is down for scheduled maintenance. But many officials and energy experts are worried that the crisis will only deepen this next maintenance, or rather after this next maintenance. Do you agree?
Well, it is normal for each of the turbines to, undergo, maintenance. Well, however, on this occasion, maybe going by the rate of, increase in sanction and the vulnerability of, some of the global economy, there is expected that, there will be disruption in supply chain. So I will not agree with that proposition in terms of maintenance because, it can be a form of retaliation and it can be a form of, maintenance. But given the fact that some of the Gazprom and some of the firms are saying that they cannot actually meet up with the earlier contracts they have signed with the EU, it might be a very great disaster because they may not be able to supply gas as expected.
And the Kremlin has been accused of energy blackmail, weaponization. Do you think this is the case here, a sort of energy injustice?
Well, it can be an energy injustice, especially when each of the households could not have access to energy at affordable price.
But Russia owns this energy we're talking about.
Yeah, it's possible that Russia owns the energy, but, any policy made, at the top, in the macroeconomics palace actually trickle down to affect the common man on the street. So, each of these common man, each of these households are going to face this reality, not really, and because of that, the price will go up. Majority of the people who are going to be suffering, who are going to be facing this price are those who do not have higher income, which their income are relatively low. So if each of household is now paying £500 in order to have access to electricity for a month, which is even beyond the 10% of their salary, it means that there will be an energy injustice. So energy injustice is a situation just when there's what we call energy deprivation problem, where you cannot access energy at a lower cost, or possibly you are not getting the right energy to use.
Indeed, spiraling cost of living, inflationary pressures. In Norway, the European Union's biggest supplier, this is of natural gas, I believe, there have been some sort of shock in terms of industries, strikes in the oil and gas industries, which recently forced companies to shut production. Do you see more shock waves? And this is also coming on the back of what we've heard from the UN Secretary General, who said that some of the two largest U.S. oil companies are making a lot of money from this. What parts would you say, either by omission or commission, that they have played in what we're seeing?
Yeah, when we talk about shockwave, if you look at the energy price is a major, factor in productivity. So this time, what is going to happen, even in the winter period, is that energy will be relocated from the industrial sector back to the household. And in this situation, there will be low in productivity, And when there's low in productivity, there will be disruption in supply chain, especially when you are producing commodities to different places. So I quite agree that different shockwaves will occur. There are about more than 6 shockwaves we are expecting. We are expecting to see a situation of stagflation, where unemployment will rise with inflation. Then we're also seeing trade shock, which will be, disruption in exchange rates. We're also seeing major production that will suffer because majority of the industrial sector will not have access to, gas. And the problem again is that it is difficult to adjust the infrastructure of major industry to be able to meet up with the requirements. So there is need for gas to actually power and produce major commodity, especially in Europe.
All right, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Dr. Olatunji Shobande is an energy economist, climate risk expert. Perhaps another time we'll talk about, how this affects countries' climate goals. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
To other stories, one of the generals in the Ukrainian army says Russia may launch an offensive in the southern region of Kherson to try to win back momentum in the war, and it has been building up forces there. He says Ukraine has improved its tactical position around the eastern city of Slovyansk and recaptured 2 villages, but that Russian forces have been trying to take the eastern city of Adimka and village of Pisky. He also says Ukrainian forces have been forced to switch to defending the outskirts of Avdiivka. Earlier this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky described the pressure his armed forces were under in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine as hell. 2 days ago, it was the Italian Parliament, and yesterday it was the turn of the US senators who approved Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO. The Senate voted 95-1 to support ratification of the documents, easily surpassing the 2/3 majority of 67 votes required to support the ratification of the 2 countries. Both countries had applied for NATO membership in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, defying Russia's repeated warnings against their joining the alliance. They both still have some way to go before a full accession can take place, as parliaments of all NATO allies have to approve the move, and Sweden and Finland can be protected by the defense clause.
Russia's unprovoked aggression in Ukraine has changed how we think about the world's security. That's why I strongly support the decision of these 2 great democracies, Sweden and Finland, to join the most important and defensive alliance in the world, NATO. I am here to give my full support for Sweden and Finland entering NATO. Finland and Sweden taking the step of NATO membership will not only strengthen their own security, but the cause of freedom in Europe and around the world. And I would say, when things are tough, we keep our friends closer.
If Finland and Sweden join NATO, the alliance will unquestionably be stronger.
Our foreign policy should be about protecting the United States, our freedoms, our people, our way of life. And expanding NATO, I believe, would not do that. Expanding NATO will require more United States forces in Europe. More manpower, more firepower, more resources, more spending. And not just now, but over the long haul. Today, I submit that means voting against expanding NATO and focusing where we must to do what we must to deter an imperial China.
Back in Ukraine, the Southern Command Operation says Russian troops are regrouping to repel possible attacks from Ukrainian forces. Local news in Ukraine reported Wednesday that Russian forces were preparing counter-offensive to advance to southern Kherson. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says Russian forces launched missile attacks on a warehouse in Radikiv of Lviv, a blast in western Ukraine, and destroyed many Polish weapons and ammunition. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky branded as disgusting the behavior of ex-German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who said Russia wanted a negotiated solution to the war. Schroeder, who is a friend of President Vladimir Putin, said he met the Kremlin leader last week, adding there was even the possibility of slowly reaching a ceasefire. According to President Zelensky, it is simply disgusting when former leaders of major states with European values work for Russia, which is a war against these values, he said in his late-night video address. Presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolak earlier dismissed Schroeder as a voice of the Russian royal court and said any negotiated peace settlement with Moscow would be contingent on a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops. Back to the United Nations, where Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he will launch a fact-finding mission into an attack in the frontline Ukrainian town of Olenivka that killed prisoners held by Moscow-backed separatists. Mr. Guterres told reporters Russia and Ukraine both requested an investigation. He said the terms of reference for the mission, which would need agreements from Russia and Ukraine, were being prepared.
Do an investigation in relation to... We received the request from the Russian Federation and the request from the Ukraine to do an investigation in relation to the events that you have mentioned. I decided, in line with my own competencies and powers, to launch a fact-finding mission. I have not the authority to do criminal investigations, but to launch a fact-finding mission. The terms of reference for that fact-finding mission are being prepared at the present moment. They will be shared with the governments of Russia and the Federation, the government of Ukraine. I hope we'll be able to have an agreement on the terms of reference of that mission. We are at the same time looking for competent, independent people that could integrate that fact-finding mission, and we hope to have all the facilities from both sides for access and for the obtention of all data that is necessary to be able to clarify the truth about what has happened. So this is a matter that we took very seriously, and we are working hard for that.
General,
Over to Kramatorsk, where residents there have been trying to get back to life as normal as possible. Today, they gathered at the flea market selling toys, Soviet medals and car parts in the eastern Ukrainian city. Speaking to a cross-section of them, 52-year-old Alexander says that he came to sell stuffed toys to have money for water and bread. Sitting at his improvised trading booth, another resident, Andrei, says he is not planning to evacuate the city. And also, the fierce fighting in the eastern Donetsk region continues. Hundreds of thousands of people are still living in combat zones. Of course, we heard in a televised address, Ukrainian president ordering the mandatory evacuation of citizens in the area, which Russia seeks to control completely, but most of them are not willing to leave. Still ahead on The World Today. Ugandan online TV bridges information gap for the deaf. We have that on there when we return. And we turn our attention to the UK, where the Bank of England today raised interest rates by the most in 27 years, despite warning that a long recession is on its way as it rushed to smother a rise in inflation, which is now set to top 13%. Reeling from a surge in energy prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the BOE's Monetary Policy Committee voted 8-1 for half a percentage point rise in bank rates to 1.75%, its highest level since late 2008 from 1.25%. Governor Andrew Bailey said all options were on the table for the BOE's next meeting in September and beyond. And Pope Francis has appointed a nurse from the Vatican's health services to be his personal medical assistant, an indication that the pontiff accepts that he will need more care as he ages. A statement identified the assistant as Massimiliano Strapetti, who until now has been coordinator of nurses and the health of facilities of the Vatican, the sovereign state surrounded by Rome. The position of personal medical assistant did not exist previously in this papacy, although Pope John Paul II, who died in 2005, had a number of medical caregivers in the final years of his life. Francis already has a personal doctor, a specialist at Rome's Gemelli Hospital, where he underwent intestinal surgery a year ago. That was the first time Pope Francis, 85, was hospitalized since his election in 2013. And he had been suffering from severe narrowing of the colon caused by diverticulitis or the formation of small bulging sacs on the intestinal wall. Recently, Father Francis has had to use a wheelchair or a cane or a walker because of knee pain caused by a small fracture and an inflamed ligament. He heals very soon. To other stories, the weather in Europe. Data from the EU's Joint Research Centre indicates that wildfires raging through Europe this summer have burned the second largest area on record. Even though the region is only halfway through its typical fire season, a dozen European countries have suffered major blazes this year, forcing thousands to evacuate, destroying homes and businesses. Countries including Italy, Spain, France still face extreme fire risk. Wildfires have burned over 600,000 hectares in EU countries this year so far. That ranks as the second highest total for any year since 2006, when records began. This country this year alone burned area more than double the size of Luxembourg. No other year in the data set had seen such a high amount of burned land in Europe by August. The Mediterranean region's typical fire season runs from June to September. And authorities in Galicia, northwest Spain, say a blaze started deliberately had been contained and evacuated residents had returned to their homes. But officials fear increasing temperatures and wind during the day could reignite the wildfire. The fire started shortly before 1300 GMT, and regional authorities said it was sparked by an arsonist. The fire burned 600 hectares, forced authorities to close roads and highways. The wildfires have ravaged many parts of southern Europe this summer as dry weather has left large swaths of countryside tinder dry, with scientists saying it is consistent with climate change. Over in France, it experienced a third heat wave this week, with the heat radiating off the asphalt outside the Garnier Opera House in Paris. It hit 56 Celsius on urban planning. This is from the expert Tanguy Ledentek's thermometer. Shade was non-existent with barely a tree in sight. The Palais de l'Opera is one of the numerous so-called urban heat islands in the French capital that are deprived of of the trees that can cool down cities by providing shade, lending a key line of defense against the heat waves that meteorologists say are intensifying because of global warming. A single minute's walk away in the shade, but along the tree-lined boulevard des Italiens gave a reading of 28 Celsius. Paris ranks poorly among global cities for its green cover, but according to data from the World Cities Culture Forum, only 10% of Paris is made up of green space, such as parks and gardens, compared to London at 33% and Oslo at 68%. Paris City Hall wants to create islands of freshness and plans to plant 170,000 trees by 2026. We move on to electoral matters here on the continent. Some 22 million voters in Kenya will pick a new president, lawmakers and county officials, August the 9th. However, the election is overshadowed by a drought that has left 4 million people dependent on food aid, while Russia's invasion of Ukraine drives up global grain and fuel prices.
In Kenya's northern Samburu County, severe droughts has forced herders to migrate hundreds of kilometers in search of pasture and water, meaning some will not vote in the elections. People are more focused on trying to save their animals and livelihoods than on casting their ballots.
It's very challenging to find one. Now that mostly when you go out there to look for a job, they will tell you that even we laid our staffs. In case we'll be having opportunity, we'll consider our laid staffs first. So it's a bit a challenge. Actually, the economy is so bad. The cost of living is high, extremely very high. Actually, right now, what we can only manage is just to put the food on our tables on a daily basis. We can't do anything apart from that, just to pay bills and everything. The little amount we make, we can't make any progress with it.
Debt levels have also surged to 9 trillion shillings, which is 67% of the GDP, from just 2 trillion, which is 40% of the GDP, when President Uhuru Kenyatta was elected. His government has modernized Kenya's crumbling century-old railway network and built more kilometers of paved roads than the previous 4 administrations combined. Kenyatta, who must stand down after serving 2 terms, says borrowing, including $8 billion from China, funded much-needed infrastructure and helped spur development. But surging living costs, which many Kenyans blame on corruption, are uppermost in voters' minds. The government has spent 12.6 billion shillings providing food for hunger-stricken communities, but says it needs more. Kenyatta's preferred successor, veteran opposition leader Raila Odinga, has pledged to renegotiate terms for the debts to lengthen its maturity and free up cash to fund social interventions and development. His main opponent, Kenyatta's estranged Deputy President William Ruto, says he would reduce borrowing and stimulate small enterprises to help drive growth and generate revenues. The winner will inherit a daunting set of problems: mounting public anger over soaring living costs, rampant unemployment, runaway state debt, and a drought that's left millions of people going hungry.
The biggest issue for any voter right now in Kenya is the cost of living. The cost of living has skyrocketed, and it is making life extremely difficult for the average Kenyan. So that is over and above everything else, is the key issue, regardless of which side of the political divide you come from, that voters would wish to see addressed. The other issues which will be of concern are education, healthcare, being able to access affordable, quality healthcare, and also dealing with corruption. I think that's an issue which never really goes away, and one which many people are concerned about.
Most previous elections in Kenya have been dogged by violence and allegations of vote rigging, and investors are on the alert for any threat to the democratic process.
Over in Uganda, a professional sign language interpreter, Susan Ananda, has set up an online television channel that bridges information gap for deaf people. She was inspired to do this after learning of a tragic incident that happened to a deaf man during the pandemic. Take a look.
When Susan Ananda heard a deaf man had been shot and wounded in Uganda for breaking a curfew during the pandemic, for which his family said he knew nothing about, she resolved to set up an online television channel for deaf people.
He didn't know what was happening in the country. He didn't know that there was curfew, and he was moving beyond curfew hours. So when he was moving, the people who are moving around, the security guys, called upon him to explain why he was moving beyond curfew hours. And unfortunately, because he did not hear, he kept on moving. So he was shot.
Late last year, she teamed up with a deaf friend, Simon Iroku, and after winning a grant, they founded Science TV, which runs news bulletins for deaf people, delivered by deaf people.
What I'm envisaging is that the future of communication must be inclusive. This implies that we have to ensure that everyone in the community should be able to understand the message you are passing on. And we believe that if information is inclusive for everyone, even us as deaf people will be able to benefit from it.
Slightly over 1 million people in Uganda, out of a total population of about 45 million, have a hearing disability, and most of them have limited access to television news due to a lack of sign language services on established channels. The news station, which made its first broadcast in April and employs 8 staff, including 4 deaf anchors, operates from a studio in a Kampala suburb. In a typical broadcast on Science TV Uganda, the news is read by 2 deaf anchors and simultaneously signed by a sign language interpreter, going slowly to match the anchor's pace, while the screen also carries subtitles.
We want to have sports, we want to have talk shows, we want to have news, daily news, where we can have stories that impact, that inform the deaf persons what is happening in the country daily.
For now, Science TV Uganda produces only 1 weekly news roundup on Saturdays due to financial, staffing and technical constraints, but Ananda said it had ambitions to expand its offer. Up to about 800 viewers have watched individual bulletins so far, and the numbers are growing.
A lovely initiative. Well, that's it on the program. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Nwaka. Have a good evening.